All right, well, John chapter 8. What we didn't talk about last time we met was the whole skipping in the Bible that you're using and I was using until I lost it. They skipped the whole section of the woman caught in adultery. Would it be worth just mentioning that and possibly why the Bible you're using skips that? So does your Bible just start at verse 12?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Well, it's not only just the New English Bible, but several other Bibles as well. Leave it and put it in as an appendix to John's Gospel.
Yeah.
And I think most of the translations, the modern translations, point out that there are some ancient copies that put it in Luke's Gospel, and it's in different places in John's Gospel as well. Oh, well, in one manuscript, it's in a different place in John's Gospel as well. So it floated around in the early, in the manuscripts, in the early copies that were made of John's Gospel. And then the other thing is that it's just out of character with John's Gospel. When you read it through, John, there's nowhere in John quite the same. It doesn't have the same feel to it. And so sort of for those two counts, because it's uncertain whether in the old copies it really belonged where it is in, it has been for a long time in the authorized version and the older versions, translations in English. And then also the fact that it isn't the same kind of writing as the rest of John. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not genuine. And I'm quite sure it is, that it's one of the stories about Jesus that circulated in the early church. And imagine there are other writings. Luke makes it quite clear that there were many other writings that recorded things about Jesus, what he did and what he taught, and this must have been one of the short writings that circulated amongst the early Christians to give them just reminders of Jesus' life as they worshipped and followed him. And
it does seem to ring true with what we know of Jesus and his character.
Yeah. And I think, yes, particularly because it makes sin not an outside thing. The woman, she was caught in adultery. How that actually happened and the bloke got away, I don't know. But she's dragged in and the evidence is overwhelming that she's been cheating on her husband. And it was obviously also a trap. And again, the Gospels say that the Pharisees were often trying to trap Jesus into doing something or other that would give them an excuse to arrest him in a serious way. And if he had condoned their desire to stone the woman to death, like it says in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy, then he would have been guilty before the Roman law of taking the law into his own hands, because only the Romans could condemn somebody to death. That's why the Jews dragged Jesus along to Pilate and had him condemned by the Romans so that he could be put to death. So it was obviously a trap. And then the other thing about it that stands out to me is that it shows that sin is not just an outward thing, but it's an inward thing. And the challenge to the Pharisees and the others who were eager to stone the woman to death, if you're free from sin, then you throw the first stone at her. And none of them were. And there must be something about his presence, that, like, if I put myself in the place of the Pharisees, I would cover up and put on a bold front and say, yep, I'm innocent of sin, I will throw the first stone. You know, nobody did it. And there must have been something about the presence of Jesus that forced people into facing the truth about themselves, facing truth in general, but also truth in themselves. That's why that passage that we've been looking at in chapter 7 and 8, that basically is what Jesus is trying to make the Pharisees and the Jews and in Jerusalem and the leaders of the nation. The whole passage is trying to make them face the truth. That could be perhaps why eventually they put that story of the woman who was an adulteress, put it right where it is, right in that same passage. Because remember, chapter 7 is where Jesus goes down to the, goes up in their language, up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles,
Yep.
secretly, or at least not publicly. And I was just thinking again, it says in the middle of the feast, when the feast was already half over, Jesus went up to the temple and began to teach. And when that was pretty bold, because he'd already spent a year or so up in Galilee to get away from the Jews who were trying to kill him. And there was no doubt about the fact that he was really a wanted man, seriously wanted, dead or alive. And the fact that he went up in the middle of the feast and began to teach in the temple, he couldn't do it more publicly, and it was a front-on challenge to the Jews for what they were doing. And it really, John just says, his hour had not yet come, and that was why he wasn't arrested. Even when it says many of the people of Jerusalem, or at least some of the people of Jerusalem, were saying, isn't this the bloke they want to put to death? And here he is teaching in the temple and nobody says a word about it. And they're beginning to say things like, well, maybe the authorities have decided that he is the Messiah. And that, that got back to the Pharisees, and they were sending sending a squad of guards with the hope of being able to arrest him. And they came back and said, nobody ever spoke like this man. And led to a bit of a rant from the Pharisees and the chief priests too. By this time, they're involved. It's a bit of a mystery how he continued to survive, and he survived. The next mention of time here is in the Feast of Dedication, which was 2 months later, and he survived in Jerusalem, and it seems like he was teaching publicly and doing miracles and making his claims very, very loudly and clearly. In fact, I think it's in chapter 7 where it says he cried in a loud voice, you know me and you know where I come from, but I haven't come on my own accord. I have been sent by the one who is true that you do not know. And things like that were claiming his relationship with the Father, with their God, and in such a way that he was challenging everybody who didn't believe it, that they had missed the whole point and they were out of tune with God. God's acting, and here they're refusing to accept. So, I think that's the challenge of Jesus, to get people to face truth about God, truth about the world in which we live, in its relationship with God, God's purposes and meaning and stuff, and to look into their own hearts. And that was the one thing that the Jews didn't want to do, to look into their own hearts and admit their ignorance.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to sort of highlight, and we didn't talk about last time when we chatted, was in chapter 8, and we read that section from verse 21 to 39, or to 30, sorry. And Jesus has talked about, they're saying, he's telling them he's going away and they can't follow, and they're wondering about where he's going and all that sort of thing. And he says, you won't believe who I am. But then he says in verse 26, I think it is, for I say only what I've heard from the one who sent me, and he is completely truthful. And this is a bit of a refrain that Jesus keeps coming back to in John's gospel, this idea that he only speaks what he hears from his Father.
Yeah.
And that's, he also, in chapter 7, we looked at how he talked about the witness for what he's doing is the Father as well. And here they don't understand who he's talking about when he mentions the Father. But I really like that idea that he only speaks what the Father tells him. There's, in Jesus, who is the Son of God, there's still this humility that he's listening to his Father, and I suppose it suggests that really close harmony. But he's also Son of Man. So there's the human side where he's got to go and spend time with his Father and hear what the Father's saying and then be completely obedient to that. How do you see that kind of working out in Jesus' life?
One of the things he said, one of those passages where he said, I speak what I've learned from the Father. It sounds as though he had learned it, like in the beginning, before he actually became a human being, that he had this harmony with the Father, and what he was actually teaching was teaching somehow or other in him as a man after the Son of God became a human being, but it was a complete harmony with God, so that his outlook and his explanations and his claims all came from that sense of unity with the Father. That he spoke with authority for the Father because of being who he was. I mean, that's one of the things he said here. Unless you believe that I am what I am, you're going to die in your sins. And over again, he talked about coming and remembering in chapter 6 when he talked about being the bread of life. In that passage there, they were trying to say that Moses had given them the manna from heaven. And Jesus' answer there was, the truth is not that Moses gave you that bread from heaven, but that my Father gives you the bread from heaven. And they said, well, give it to us again. Show us that you are who you are by feeding us like you did when you fed the 5,000. And that's when he said, no. First of all, he said, the bread that God gives comes down from heaven and brings life to the world. He was conscious that his actual coming into the world was bringing something new that had been missing from the human race ever since the rebellion in the beginning, when God had told Adam and Eve in the garden, you eat this fruit, you're going to die. And so death had been out of where the human race lived, in the darkness of death. And Jesus is saying back there, in referring to himself as the bread of life, as the life that God provides as a way out from the darkness. And that's what he said to the Jews. I am the bread of life. He that comes to me will never hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. So those kind of claims, I think, are kind of inherent in Jesus, including his knowledge of the truth, his whole outlook. When he spoke from that, out of that deep relationship that was way behind him being the Son of Man, and which defined him as the Son of Man, that he was God incarnate, God present in the flesh. Like he said later, he who has seen me has seen the Father. He who believes in me doesn't believe in me, he believes in the one who sent me. So he personally carried a consciousness of who he really was as the Word who had been with God before creation even, who had become flesh and dwelt amongst us. He carried that consciousness of who he was. And I think that's why, like, when the woman who had been dragged before him to get stoned to death because of adultery, just his power, his presence there with the woman was as much an influence upon the men who wanted to kill her as what he said, more so even. I think I'm rambling.
It seems that his attitude is in stark contrast to the rest of humanity, who are not listening to the Father. And that's one of the big points that he keeps making about the Pharisees, that they won't listen.
Yeah.
They listen and see what's going on right in front of them. But even, you go back to the Garden of Eden, that's the heart of the problem, is that people didn't listen and stay true to what the Father had told them. And here you have one who his whole sort of purpose and whole mission is to listen and do what his Father tells him.
Yeah. At the end of that passage, he says, the one who sent me is with me now. He has not left me alone, for I always do what the Father desires, something like that. I always do what is acceptable to him, and that's the presence of the Father and his own consciousness that he was living and speaking totally in that relationship. He was full of God because he was God. And like I was saying, somebody who thinks like that is either a madman or he carries with him one huge sense of presence, a power. And I think that section ends where John makes the comment, as he said this, many put their faith in him.
Yeah.
And the Jews didn't, and the rulers didn't, and many of the people didn't, but some did. And it was partly what he said, but it must have been as well that presence that I've been talking about, that sense that, in fact, when, like, he actually referred to it himself. Remember when he said, I am the light of the world, no follower of mine will walk in the darkness. The Jews' response was, you are witness in your own cause. Your witness is not valid. And Jesus' comment was, my testimony is valid because I know where I come from and where I'm going. That, I think, too, is that reference to the sense that he had. It's just something in me has moved greatly as I kind of get a feeling for that that presence. I can't explain it any other way. And to know that he's with me right now. And my endeavor is to somehow or other get into my bring my life into harmony with that presence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next section, we'll start now from verse 31. Jesus said to the people who believed in him, "You are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But we are descendants of Abraham, they said. "We have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean you will be set free?" Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave of sin. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is part of the family forever. So if the Son sets you free, you are truly free. Yes, I realize that you are descendants of Abraham, and yet some of you are trying to kill me because there's no room in your hearts for my message. I am telling you what I saw when I was with my father, but you are following the advice of your father." It's a great section. And I love that picture there, that call to remain faithful to his teaching right at the start. And then the power of truth and being set free by his truth. What do you think when they had an understanding of truth because they had the law and the prophets and they had the Proverbs and all of those things? And truth is something that people grapple with. It's something that comes up later with Pilate. You know, Pilate says, "What is truth?"
Oh.
What's the understanding that they had and that we need to have about this kind of truth that Jesus is talking about here?
Yeah, well, for them, the truth was the law that God had entered into a covenant with Israel, and that the law fully expressed that covenant. And so, by God's act, they were safe, privileged, looked after, if only they obeyed the law. And that was in the mind of that was the truth that for them was uh, all of it, all they needed. Because if they only kept the law, then God was on their side and everything would be right for them. I think there's got to be, there are two different words for truth. Won't get into that now, but it's like I've just referred to at the beginning of chapter 8, where he said, "I'm the light of the world." He's not claiming to be revealing the light, as truth. He's not claiming to be one of the revealers of light, like, say, the prophets were in the Old Testament, but he actually is himself the life. And it's the same with truth. Later on, he says, "I am the truth." And I think the basic idea behind all of these statements of Jesus is that there is that we human beings are out of touch with light and life and truth, that because of our rebellion against God and our attempt to live without a creator, we've created our own light and we've created our own truth. And I mean, the whole scientific endeavor, if you can see it just as the amazing ability that God has given the human race to find out truth about this world, but that's not the answer to all the questions at all, that there's a whole lot more truth that we need to grasp about why we're here in the first place, and what is it that started us, and where did the whole idea of existence come from, and all that sort of thing. Science can't address that. And if we can see that there's more to truth than just our own independent effort, and more to light than our own light that we've gained by ourselves, that real truth isn't a matter of understanding propositions, but it's a relationship with the one who is truth. The same as with, like Jesus said about light. It's he said, "I am light. No follower of mine will wander in the dark, but shall have the light of life." You know, you could be the greatest scientist in the world and have an encyclopedic knowledge about this world and how it works. But if you haven't got Jesus, you haven't got truth.
Mm.
If you haven't got Jesus, you haven't got light. In fact, if you haven't got Jesus, you haven't got life, not real life. All of that comes out of a bigger world, a bigger reality. It all comes out of God's plan for the totality of his creation. And in that totality, he is king and father and wants to love us and welcome us and show us how to be part of who he is in the same way that Jesus is. It's fantastic when you think about what God has done to bring us into the middle of truth.
Yeah.
And that's what Jesus has said. Unless you believe that I am what I am, you will die in your sin.
Well, and even more than that, he's saying here there's sort of a contrast between truth and then freedom, because he says, "You are truly my disciples, and you know the truth. The truth will set you free," but then that you actually can become a slave to sin. And that's
Not,
when that discussion about sin and slavery. I tell you the truth, anyone who sins is a slave of sin. The slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is part of the family forever. So if the son sets you free, you are truly free. And then they have the discussion saying, well, we're not a slave to anyone. Our father is Abraham. And he says, if you were truly the children of Abraham, you would follow his example. Instead, you are trying to kill me because I told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham never did such a thing. No, you are imitating your real father. They replied, we aren't illegitimate children. God himself is our true father. And then Jesus says, if God were your father, you would love me because I've come to you from God. I'm not here on my own, but he sent me. Why can't you understand what I'm saying? So Jesus seems to understand that slavery that they're under and who they're truly serving. They can't see it. And it's a question of who you actually belong to. So they're saying we're not illegitimate. Obviously, their identity was tied up pretty strongly in that connection with Abraham. Yet here is Jesus challenging that and trying to help them see that they're actually slaves to sin and that they actually serve another master. And I imagine that made them feel pretty cranky.
everything he said made them feel cranky.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do we do with that? Well, they were slaves. I mean, we sort of understand this whole discussion in light of the sorts of things that Paul says later about being slaves to sin. And he kind of fleshes it out a bit more. What was their understanding, do you think, of sin?
Obviously, a very, again, like that lady that they wanted to kill because she was caught as in bed with a bloke, a married woman who was caught in bed with another bloke. For them, it was an external thing. And again, you can see why, you know, the first Christians finally decided to pop that story into the middle of John's time at the, well, where John's describing Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles, because again, for them, sin was the external thing and not the internal sense of a conscience that delineated sin, not just in terms of outward physical acts, but inward impulses and feelings and impulses of, and not just inward feelings and our following our instincts, but also I think somewhere in Ephesians, Paul says we were dead. Time was when you were dead in your sins and wickedness, when you followed the ways of this present, evil ways of this present age, and obeyed the ruler of the powers of the air, the same spirit that is at work in God's disobedient people. And he outlines there that it's not just our instincts, but it's our notions. And it goes right back to the orientation of the human race as somehow rather self-sufficient. They have light according to their own understanding. They have goodness according to their own understanding. And that explains the Jews. The law, the law fed their own sense of who they were and their own goodness in terms of obedience to the law, the outward thing, but they missed out on what Jesus was trying to say. Look, it's bigger than that. It goes right to the core of your identity. You have to realize that because of sin, you're cut off from God, and here I am bringing the light, the truth, and I am the light, and I am the truth, and I do give the water of life, and I do give the bread from heaven. It's all caught up in moving away from your own concept of who you are and what life is all about, and accepting this new perspective. Unless you believe I am what I am, you'll die in your sin, Jesus said. And several times, like even when he said he was sent by God, that's repeated over and over and over again. And in that passage where he claimed to be the I am, he says, what is it? Something like, you are from this world below. I am from the world above. You belong to this world. You belong to this world. I do not. That's why I tell you that unless you believe that I am what I am, you'll die in your sins.
Yeah.
He's come to take us into the bigger world, into the bigger reality, to save us from ignorance and darkness and sin, to save us from our own being wrapped up in ourselves and thinking we're sufficient without acknowledging fully that we're creatures and that there is a God who made us with, and this God's got a purpose. And until we find that purpose and join ourselves willingly to that purpose, then our lives are in the dark and not knowing truth, wandering in the dark.
Well, we're also in slavery, according to what Jesus is saying as well.
And slavery as well. Precisely.
Yeah. And that he's got the power to free us from that.
Yeah.
I've been reading Matthew lately, and there's quite a few statements Jesus makes there about sin and how it comes out of it's not what goes into a man, but what comes out of them that is where sin is coming from. And that it's even in after the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of those behaviors, well, not behaviors, as attitudes that he's teaching are about what's going on in the inner person. And a real focus on that.
Yeah.
And that sort of shaping, well, that's how our response needs to happen from that belief and that inner world.
And that's where the Jews missed it completely, because they thought they could, all they needed to do was to do the external rituals and keep the external commandments about how to live. one of the places I think it's in all of the other Gospels, not in John, where Jesus said, you pay tithes on parsley and other herbs, but you neglect love and justice.
Yeah.
And he's saying, these are the things you should have concentrated on and not to have neglected the others. But I think that, where does love come from? Everybody says and knows that the world would be a lot better off if we all loved each other, if the Taliban really loved human beings instead of seeing them as just external sort of puppets to be
Yeah.
moved around by the law of Allah in the Quran, for example.
Yeah.
If the Taliban really knew what love was about, how different the world would be. And over in Turkey, Erdogan, is it Erdogan, their president? He formed this party called Truth and Justice, but there's no truth. And just a few days ago, Turkish forces were bombing Kurdish Christian villages,
Yeah.
saying they're terrorists. What a hypocrite. What a total hypocrite. And because his mind's filled with the teaching of Islam, and then his own soul, I think, is just desiring his own power and position, so that the world is totally deluded and desperately in need of light and love and truth. And this is exactly the message that Jesus has. Sometimes, like just the last few days, some group that has aligned itself with ISIS in Tanzania uh, has invaded a port town where there's a gas loading facility that the West has built there for billions and billions of dollars. But anyway, this ISIS group, funded by Iran and probably a little bit also from the Gulf states and Arabia, where the wealth is, petro wealth, they've invaded and taken over the town. And I mean, that's bad, destroying so much and so much brutality. I don't know how many thousands have had to flee. They've been trapped, actually, and who knows what's happening over there even as we speak right now. And that's half the problem. But the other half of the problem, the president of Tanzania, as sits there with his pot belly fed and looked after, isn't bothering to send the army to rescue the town. He's just said this sort of thing happens all the time.
Yeah. Right.
It's just the world has failed to recognize that the real issues that are going on are truth, to do with truth and with real justice, not what is voted on by the United Nations uh, charade, basically, where just recently the Arab nations, I think, in a block, and I think I don't think there's enough of them to sway, but they want a permanent panel created by the United Nations to keep watch over Israel so that it doesn't commit genocidal atrocities and war crimes against Hamas over in Gaza. The things that are happening are so devoid of truth on such a scale that I just can't get my head around the fact that we Westerners who have a Christian tradition and where the churches are preaching in our country right now, where we can't see that the truth will never come unless Jesus is accepted as who he is. Not just his teaching, but him himself, who is the source of of truth and of justice and of life and of love and of light. He has the water of true life to give to us, and that's what we need. I'm ranting again, but yeah, this is so relevant, what Jesus said 2,000 years ago, to the world that we live in right now. And we Christians have, sit back here in the security of Australia feeling content and talking about going to heaven or having parties or something. How do you let the world know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? Unless we live it ourselves in the first place. I guess that's the only answer that I've come up with to satisfy myself. It says, okay, Macintosh, just do it. Do it yourself.
Yeah, just do it. And I suppose hope that some of that mustard seed thing can happen where your response influences others, so you can then influence others.
I think, Lucas, I think we need to grasp what we were talking about before, that, there was a presence with Jesus so that he lived and taught for 2 months, most of the time in Jerusalem, where they were seeking to kill him, where they wanted to put him to death. And they didn't do it. He did have to leave at the end after the Feast of
Dedication.
for a little while. And even after he came back and raised Lazarus from the dead, he also had to leave for a little while.
Yes.
The next time he came in was at Passover, 3 months later, and they got him, but only because it was his time. He knew that it wasn't only just a matter of him teaching and being present as the Son of Man who was the Son of God, but also that as the Son of Man, he had to pay the price for all of this corruption and cruelty, this whole charade of truth and justice that's being talked about in Turkey and other places in the world where Jesus is not acknowledged as who he is, the truth.
Yeah.
Damn it, the truth. And I think living that ourselves gives us something of the power of that presence. In the same way as Jesus said, you are the light of the world. Do your good works in front of men so that they might give thanks to the Father who's in heaven.
Yeah.
I think there should be a freedom in us. If Jesus said, you follow me and you're free, we should be free to talk about Jesus in a way that, whether it offends others or not, the offence won't be because of us saying it, if we're actually living it in the full power of his presence inside us. Anyway, here I
go. Well, we better leave it there.
Okay.
We've run out of time. Thanks, Laurie.
Thanks, Lucas. You stir me up, I tell you.
We'll keep going with John 8 next week.
Okay.
From 40. We'll try and get to the end of John 8 next time.
Okie doke. Good on. Have a good lockdown.
Yeah, you too. See ya.
See ya.